Okay, so let's talk about setting up your Hilt identification with the tangible ID system on the CFX. So I'm going to give kind of an overview of what I did, but a lot of the in-depth information is in the instruction manual for the CFX, which is really, really well written and has a lot of good information. So this is not a substitution for reading the manual. The first thing that you're going to need to do is pick a 10K resistor, and I would pick something with a tight tolerance. So cheap resistors might have plus or minus 10% or plus or minus 20%, and what that's ultimately is going to mean for you is that your font selection might be less accurate or harder to deal with because the 10K resistance is not very close to 10K actually. So buy a resistor that is has a tight tolerance, and then also not a very big resistor. You can get a low wattage, a small resistor, so it doesn't take up a lot of space on the board. For my system, there's going to be a wire coming off of this pad here, which is going to go to pin 8 on the GX16 connector on the modular chassis unit. We've got that up here in the pinout as a green wire connected to pin 8 for the ID system. And that wire is going to go from the board all the way to pin 8 on the GX16 connector on the modular chassis unit. The GX16 connector on the Hilt side is going to have this resistor going from pin 8 to ground. So on the Hilt side GX16 connector, you're going to have a resistor that goes from pin 8 to pin 1. And that's going to complete this circuit. So when you connect the modular chassis unit to the GX16 connector in the Hilt, it's going to complete this voltage divider and trigger the tangible ID system to select the font and settings for that Hilt. Also in the user manual, they have laid out the different font slots and approximated resistances for those slots. I'm going to show you later in this video how to experimentally determine exactly where each of those slots are. It'll save you a little bit of headache later. And then there's 2 slots that we're going to reserve for something else. So the last slot, which is a resistance of an open circuit or an extremely high resistance. This is going to be our tangible ID for when the module is pulled out of a Hilt. Because what's going to happen is when we disconnect the Hilt from the chassis unit, this connection right here is going to get broken. And then the voltage divider here is going to show that this resistance is an open circuit or an extremely large resistance. And we want that. We want the system to be able to know when the module is pulled out of a Hilt. So that last one is reserved, and I'll show you how to set that up. And then I suggest that this one down here, which has a resistance of 0, or basically you just have a wire here instead of a resistor, I would reserve that to just be sort of like your default font. If you end up with more than 15 sabers, you want to have like maybe one default font that can cover all your generic sabers that you're happy with, just that main font. Okay, so actually getting things configured, you need to go to your SD card, and the top level folder of your SD card is a file called special.txt. This is where you can set all of this up. So that last font, which is the open circuit when the modular chassis unit has been pulled out, what we want is we're going to put a capital X there. And the note here tells us what that means. It means don't allow someone to ignite the saber, and if we switch into this font, retract the blade. So if the saber's on, the blade's ignited, and we pull the modular chassis unit out, it's going to retract the blade. It's going to play that nice disconnecting sound, and it's not going to let us start up the saber. So it gives us the behavior that we want to model. The rest of it's really easy. You just put the number for the font that you would like to trigger in those positions. So in this particular case, I want this third slot, which is 2.7 kiloohms, or is triggered by a resistance of 2.7 kiloohms. I want that to recognize as one of my ASP sabers. And I want it to use the second font on my SD card. Okay, so we can set that up with each of ours. If you also want to do custom settings for your fonts, like my this unhinged font that I use for my crossguard, I need to turn on the trident setting. So you may not have this file in your folder, so you might have to create a file called special.txt. Now in this case, we're inside the font folder. We're going to open that up, and we're going to put any settings in here that we want. So we can override a lot of settings, but in this case, I just wanted to change the trident strip value to 16. And you want to do it just like this. Don't put extra spaces in here. It's going to slow down the parsing. That's all explained in the user's manual. And then also make sure that there is a new line or a carriage return between your last setting and the end of the file. Okay, otherwise it won't parse correctly. So you want to make sure that you've got a blank new line down here at the end of the whole file. For your other sabers, or for your other hilts, you want to make sure that if you go from the unhinged font back to, or sorry, if you want to make sure if you go from your crossguard back to something that's not a crossguard, that setting gets overwritten again back to having a trident value of 0. So all your other fonts are going to need an override as well. And in this case, we're going to override the value to 0 so that we can turn that back off. So when trying to pick the right resistor for the Hilt identification on the CFX, something that I found helps out a lot is taking a spare GX16 connector and using that to test out resistors. So I've wired up just 2 jumper cables. For my pinout, ground is pin 1 and the tangible ID resistor is on pin 8. And what we're going to do is we're going to take the resistor and link it to the ground pin. So I've got that set up like this. Let's say that I want to test out a resistor and make sure that it's consistently selecting the correct font. So here I've got a 2.7K resistor, and I want to make sure that that's going to select the correct font. Okay. So if you notice when the first time I plugged it in, it said Hoth and then it said Rogue. So 2 things can be happening if that's, or 2 things can be going on if that's happening. One, it could be that your resistor that you've picked is too close to another font, and you need to kind of space those resistors out a little bit farther. Another thing that could happen is just, well, you maybe, because this is not a permanent solution, maybe you just don't have a very good connection. So we can just make sure, in this case, we're going to unplug and replug it. And if it's not, if it's the same font, it won't like re-announce the boot font, so we'll know it keeps selecting the same one. So we'll just try that a couple of times and make sure that it's consistent. Another thing that you could do is when you're initially mapping out what resistances you want for each of your, say, up to 16 hilts, instead of using the resistor at first, you could attach a potentiometer and sweep through the resistances, and then also use a multimeter to measure those resistances, and try to find a good midpoint between each of the fonts that are getting selected, so that you kind of know what you're aiming for, and then pick the resistor that you're using. I do think that you should, when you're picking resistors, pick a resistor with a pretty tight tolerance, so that you can be sure that you're getting the resistance that's listed. You can, I would definitely measure the resistor before you wire it up to make sure it's close to what you're expecting it should be. And the other thing is, as is explained in the CFX instruction manual, you're going to need a 10K resistor on the board to set up the voltage divider for the Hilt identification. And in this case, I like to put mine on the top, and you don't need a high wattage resistor. So like this resistor, the size of the resistor is based on the wattage, or the heat that it can dissipate as current goes through it. And we really don't want something this large sitting on the top of the board. It's taking up a ton of space, and the voltage divider is not going to be accepting a ton of current. So a lower wattage resistor that's smaller, fitting right on top of the board there, I think is the ideal place for it. And then I just wrapped it in some heat shrink just because I wanted to kind of keep that cool black and gold feel as much as I could. So I just covered up that resistor so it didn't stick out.